You think you know the story of Robespierre's fall, the tyrant silenced by brave revolutionaries, the architect of terror finally getting what he deserved. Clean, simple, justice served. But the reality of July 27, 1794 was so much worse than any propaganda could capture. Because Maximilien Robespierre didn't just die. He was devoured by the exact system he spent 2 years perfecting, and his final hours were more terrifying than anything his enemies claimed because they were terrifyingly familiar to anyone who'd faced the Revolutionary Tribunal. It's 9 Thermidor, year 2 in the revolutionary calendar. The morning session of the National Convention is about to begin. Robespierre arrives expecting another routine day of accusations, another opportunity to purge enemies of the Republic. He's done this hundreds of times. Stand at the tribune, name the conspirators, watch them arrested. By evening, they're in the conciergerie prison. Within days, their heads roll. The system works with mechanical efficiency. But today, something's different. The moment Robespierre tries to speak, the whole explodes. Down with the tyrant. Jean-Lambert Tallien, a deputy who'd been quietly building opposition for weeks, is on his feet screaming. Others join him. The noise is deafening. For 2 years, Robespierre's voice has silenced everyone. Today, everyone's voice silences him. He tries again. I ask to speak. More shouting. Down with the dictator. He attempts to gesture for order. The president rings the bell continuously, deliberately drowning him out. Here's what most people don't understand about this moment. This wasn't brave men standing up to tyranny. This was the terror eating itself. Every deputy in that room had helped build the system Robespierre now represented. They'd voted for the law of 22 Prairial just 6 weeks earlier. The law that eliminated the right to legal defense and turned accusation into automatic death sentence. They'd applauded as the Revolutionary Tribunal streamlined executions. Between June and July 1794, approximately 1,400 people were guillotined in Paris alone. The machinery of death they'd all supported was running at peak efficiency. But then Robespierre made his fatal mistake. 2 days earlier, on July 26, he'd given a speech warning of conspirators within the convention itself, except he refused to name them. For 2 hours he spoke about enemies of the Republic, about traitors in their midst, about the need for one more purge. But he wouldn't say who. In a system where accusation meant execution, that vague threat was a loaded gun pointed at everyone. Joseph Fouché, Paul Barras, Tallien, dozens of others, they all realized the same thing that night. Any one of them could be next. So they did what the system had taught them to do. They struck first. Back in the convention on July 27th, Robespierre is still trying to speak. His voice is hoarse from shouting over the chaos. He points at deputies, tries to single out attackers, but it's useless. The president of the convention, Collot d'Herbois, another former ally, is actively working against him. Every time Robespierre opens his mouth, the bell rings. This goes on for hours, not minutes, hours. By 5 p.m. Robespierre has barely spoken 10 consecutive words. Then comes the vote. Not for trial. Not for investigation. Just arrest. Immediate arrest based on nothing but accusation. The same process Robespierre had used against hundreds of others. No evidence needed. No defense allowed. No investigation required. One deputy stands and declares Robespierre an enemy of the Republic. Another seconds it. The vote is called. Hands shoot up across the hall. The decree passes. Maximilien Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Georges Couthon, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, and several others are ordered arrested immediately. The Paris Commune, still loyal to Robespierre, refuses to imprison him. Instead, they take him and his allies to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. It's early evening now. Robespierre sits in the building where he's planned so many purges, surrounded by maybe 3,000 National Guardsmen still loyal to him, but thousands more are gathering outside, sent by the convention. The building is surrounded and everyone inside knows exactly what happens next because they've all seen it happen to others. The system doesn't negotiate. It doesn't show mercy. It doesn't conduct investigations. It simply eliminates threats. As night falls on July 27th, Robespierre sits in an upstairs office of the Hôtel de Ville. The man who sent thousands to their deaths without trial is about to experience the system he created firsthand. And the most terrifying part, it's going to work exactly as designed. The hours between 10 p.m. on July 27th and 2 a.m. on July 28th were some of the longest in Robespierre's life. But here's what makes them truly horrifying. They were nothing special. Thousands of people had experienced these exact same hours before him, sitting in a room, knowing arrest was coming, knowing what arrest meant, knowing there would be no trial, no defense, no mercy. The only difference was that Robespierre had personally signed many of their death warrants. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, the atmosphere is deteriorating fast. The 3,000 National Guardsmen who initially rallied to defend Robespierre are starting to drift away. They're not cowards, they're practical. The convention has declared Robespierre an outlaw, which under revolutionary law means anyone can kill him without trial. Supporting an outlaw makes you an outlaw, and everyone knows what happens to outlaws. By midnight, maybe a few hundred men remain. By 1 a.m., even fewer. Robespierre sits with his closest allies, Saint-Just, the 26-year-old who wrote some of the terror's most radical legislation. Georges Couthon, paralyzed from the waist down, who'd helped draft the law of 22 Prairial that eliminated legal defenses. Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother. Philippe Labusse, his old school friend. These are the men who built the machinery of the terror together. Now they're sitting in a room, listening to that same machinery grinding toward them. Outside forces under Paul Barras are preparing to storm the building. Barras knows this building well. He's been here for meetings of the Commune dozens of times. He knows the layout, knows which doors are weakest, knows exactly how to take it. Around 2 a.m., he gives the order. Troops surge into the Hotel de Ville. There's confusion, shouting, the sound of boots on stairs, and then a gunshot. This is where historical records get messy, and that messiness is important because it reveals something about how the terror actually worked. What we know for certain is that Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered, bleeding massively from a wound to his face. What we don't know for certain is how he got that wound. There are two versions, both supported by eyewitnesses, both documented in the historical record. Version 1, Robespierre tried to shoot himself. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a pistol in his hand or near him. The wound was consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot. Under this version, Robespierre, facing the same fate he'd imposed on thousands, tried to escape the guillotine the way several of his victims had attempted to escape it, by taking his own life. But like many suicide attempts with 18th century pistols, it failed catastrophically. The bullet didn't kill him, it destroyed his jaw. Version 2, a soldier named Charles-André Murder shot him. Murder himself claimed credit for the shot, saying he fired at Robespierre to prevent his escape. Other witnesses supported this version. Under this account, Robespierre was deliberately shot by an attacker during the invasion. Either way, the result was the same. Robespierre was found on the floor of the council chamber, blood pouring from a massive wound in his lower face. His jaw was shattered, teeth were gone. The ability to speak, which had been his greatest weapon for years, was destroyed in an instant. Here's why both versions are equally terrifying. If it was suicide, Robespierre was so afraid of the system he created that he tried to die by his own hand rather than face it. If it was murder, then he was shot without trial, without investigation, exactly the way his own laws permitted. Either way, the terror was working as designed, quick, brutal, no due process, no mercy. What happened next is documented by multiple witnesses. Robespierre was carried down the stairs of the Hotel de Ville, bleeding heavily. They laid him on a table in the ground floor meeting room, a plank of wood serving as a crude stretcher. His jaw was hanging loose, destroyed, blood soaked through whatever they used to try to stop the bleeding. And here's the truly grotesque detail that multiple sources confirm. He was conscious, fully aware, unable to speak because of the wound, but completely conscious of everything happening to him. Around 3 a.m. they moved him to the conciergerie prison, the same prison he'd sent hundreds of people to in the previous months, the same cells where his victims had waited for their turn at the guillotine, the same stone walls that had heard countless prisoners crying, praying, trying to process the fact that they would die without ever getting to defend themselves. Robespierre was now one of them. At the conciergerie he received no medical treatment, none. This wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. This was standard procedure. Under the laws Robespierre himself had helped pass, people condemned by the Revolutionary Tribunal weren't entitled to medical care. They were dead already, just waiting for the formality of execution. Why waste a doctor's time on a corpse? The prison guards gave him a box to use as a pillow and left him on a table. His jaw continued to bleed. The pain must have been indescribable, and he couldn't even scream properly because his jaw was destroyed. But wait, here's where it gets even worse. Robespierre had to wait. Not for a trial. The Revolutionary Tribunal didn't bother with actual trials anymore, not after the law of 22 Prairial. He was waiting for his turn at the guillotine, and the guillotine ran on a schedule. Charles Henry Sansson, the executioner of Paris, had to prepare. Carts had to be arranged. The route through the city had to be cleared. All the bureaucratic details of state murder had to be managed. So Robespierre lay on that table in the conciergerie, jaw shattered, bleeding, in agony, fully conscious, waiting for the machine he'd fed so efficiently to finally take him. The sun came up on July 28th. Guards came to collect him and his allies. 22 men total would die that day. Georges Couthon, Augustin Robespierre, Philippe Labusse had actually succeeded in shooting himself fatally the night before, the only one of the group to escape the guillotine. The others were loaded into carts for the journey through Paris to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine waited. The same journey thousands had made before them, the same route, the same crowds, the same destination. The system was working perfectly, and Robespierre, unable to speak, unable to even close his mouth properly because of his shattered jaw, could only watch as the final act of the play he'd written approached its inevitable conclusion. By midday on July 28th, Robespierre had been lying in the conciergerie for about 9 hours with a shattered jaw, no medical treatment, and the certain knowledge of what was coming. But here's what makes this moment historically significant. He wasn't going to get a trial. Not because the revolutionary government was being especially cruel to him, but because he had personally helped eliminate the need for trials in the first place. Let's talk about how the Revolutionary Tribunal actually worked by the summer of 1794. Because understanding the system is crucial to understanding why Robespierre's final hours were so terrifying. The tribunal had existed since March 1793, but it went through a dramatic transformation in June 1794 with the Law of 22 Prairial. This law, which Robespierre supported and helped implement, fundamentally changed how revolutionary justice operated. Under the Law of Prairial, the tribunal no longer needed to hear witnesses for the defense. Defendants couldn't have lawyers. The only question judges needed to answer was whether the accused was an enemy of the people, not what they did, not whether evidence existed, just whether they were enemies. And how did you determine that? By accusation. If the Committee of Public Safety or the Committee of General Security accused you, that was essentially proof enough. The trial became a formality, usually lasting a few hours at most. The verdict was predetermined, guilty. The sentence was always the same, death. Between the passage of this law in June and Robespierre's fall in July, approximately 1,400 people were executed in Paris alone. That's about 25 executions per day, every single day, for 6 weeks. The Revolutionary Tribunal wasn't investigating crimes anymore. It was processing bodies. Accusation, brief appearance before judges, guilty verdict, cart to the guillotine. The whole process could be completed in less than 24 hours from arrest to execution. Now, on July 28th, this same system was processing Robespierre, except there was an additional layer of efficiency. The convention had declared him an outlaw the previous day. Under revolutionary law, outlaws didn't even need the formality of a tribunal appearance. They'd placed themselves outside the law by their actions, so the law no longer protected them. They could be executed immediately upon identification. This was the same status applied to rebels, emigres who'd fled France, and anyone who actively resisted arrest. Think about the absolute perfection of this irony. Robespierre had spent months defending the tribunal's efficiency. He'd argued that excessive legal protections for defendants only protected traitors. He'd insisted that the Republic's survival required swift justice. He'd pushed for laws that eliminated appeals, eliminated defense attorneys, eliminated the presumption of innocence. And now, lying on a table in the conciergerie with his face destroyed, he was experiencing the ultimate expression of the system he'd championed. No trial, no defense, no appeal, just execution. But the real horror wasn't the lack of legal process. It was how normalized this had become. The prison guards at the conciergerie had seen hundreds of prisoners come through in recent months. Some were former nobles, some were merchants accused of hoarding, some were priests who refused to swear loyalty to the revolution. Some were just people who'd said the wrong thing to the wrong neighbor. They all got the same treatment. No medical care, no special accommodations. Just a cell or a spot on the floor, and waiting for your name to be called for the cart to the guillotine. Historical records from the conciergerie show that by the summer of 1794, the prison was processing prisoners like an assembly line. New prisoners would arrive from the tribunal. Guards would register them, assign them a space, and add them to the execution list. Usually within a day or two, their names would be called. They'd be loaded into the carts and taken to the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine would be waiting. The whole system ran with mechanical efficiency. For Robespierre, there was no special treatment. The guards who watched him bleeding on that table had watched hundreds of others in similar states. Some prisoners had tried to kill themselves and failed. Some had been beaten during arrest. Some were sick or injured. The guards' job wasn't to care for them. It was to make sure they stayed alive long enough to be executed properly. That was the only medical concern that mattered. Don't let them die before the guillotine gets them. Around midday, officials from the Revolutionary Tribunal arrived at the conciergerie, but they weren't there to conduct a trial. They were there to formally identify the prisoners and confirm they were the ones named in the decree. Robespierre's identity was confirmed. Saint Just's identity was confirmed. Couthon, despite his paralysis and obvious inability to have physically resisted arrest, was confirmed. Augustin Robespierre was confirmed. Down the list they went. 22 names total. 22 men who would die that afternoon. The only question asked was, "Are you Maximilien Robespierre?" He apparently nodded, unable to speak clearly because of his shattered jaw. That was it. That was the entirety of his legal process. Identity confirmed. Status as outlaw already established by the convention's decree. No testimony needed. No evidence presented. No defense offered. The same process applied to all 22 men. The entire identification process took maybe an hour for all of them. This is what makes Robespierre's final hours more terrifying than his enemies claimed. His enemies portrayed his fall as justice, as tyranny finally being punished. But the reality was worse than that. It wasn't justice. It was the terror functioning exactly as designed. Robespierre wasn't being treated cruelly or unusually. He was being treated exactly the same way thousands of his victims had been treated. And that perfect, mechanical equality of the system was far more horrifying than any personal revenge could be. By early afternoon, the preparations were complete. The executioner, Charles Henry Sansson, had been notified. The carts were ready. The guillotine at the Place de la Révolution had been inspected and prepared for a busy day. 22 executions would take several hours to complete properly. The route through Paris had been cleared. Everything was ready. The machine was about to take its architect. Around 3 p.m. on July 28, guards came to collect Robespierre and his 21 condemned allies from the conciergerie. This journey from prison to guillotine was called the voyage, and by the summer of 1794, it had become a well-rehearsed routine. Prisoners were loaded into open carts, their hands tied behind their backs, and driven through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution. The route was always the same. The timing was predictable, and the crowds that lined the streets knew exactly what they were watching. But here's what's documented about this particular journey. It was different, not in process. That ran exactly as it always did, different in reaction. For months, Parisians had watched these carts roll by carrying aristocrats, priests, merchants, officials, ordinary citizens accused of crimes against the Republic. The crowd's reactions varied, sometimes hostile, sometimes indifferent, sometimes sympathetic. But when the cart carrying Robespierre rolled through the streets, the reaction was overwhelmingly hostile. Contemporary accounts describe crowds screaming insults, throwing things, spitting at the carts. Death to the tyrant. Look at the dictator now. Women who had lost family members to the guillotine shouted accusations. Men whose friends had been arrested and executed yelled curses. This wasn't spontaneous. Many of these people had genuine grievances. The terror had touched almost everyone in Paris by this point. Nearly everyone had lost someone, or knew someone who'd been arrested, or lived in fear of denunciation. But here's the dark irony that contemporary observers noted. Many of the people screaming at Robespierre had cheered at earlier executions. They'd applauded when aristocrats were guillotined. They'd celebrated when priests who refused to swear loyalty were executed. They'd supported the revolution's violence when it targeted others. The terror enjoyed popular support for a long time, right up until people realized it could target them too. Now they were expressing rage at the man who'd become the face of a system they'd helped sustain. Robespierre sat in the cart, unable to respond to any of it. His jaw was still bandaged, soaked with blood. Witnesses describe him sitting very still, head tilted back slightly, trying to manage the pain. He couldn't close his mouth properly. He couldn't speak. He could only listen to the howling crowds and know exactly what was waiting at the end of this journey, because he'd sent so many others on this same route. The journey took about an hour. The carts moved slowly through crowded streets, giving people plenty of time to see the condemned. This was part of the ritual. Public execution wasn't just about killing enemies of the Republic. It was about spectacle, about demonstrating the power of the state, about creating a visible reminder of what happened to those who opposed the revolution. Every prisoner who made this journey was a message to everyone watching. Saint just sat in the same cart as Robespierre. He was 26 years old, a brilliant theorist who'd written some of the revolution's most radical legislation. He'd argued passionately for the terror, defending it as necessary medicine for a sick society. Now he was sitting in a cart heading to the guillotine, facing the direct consequence of the policies he'd advocated. Contemporary accounts describe him as calm, almost detached, as if he was observing his own execution as an intellectual exercise. Georges Couthon was in another cart, paralyzed from the waist down. He had to be carried everywhere. During the invasion of the Hôtel de Ville, he'd allegedly tried to escape by sliding down a staircase, falling and injuring himself further. Now he sat in the cart, unable to walk, unable to flee, just waiting. His paralysis probably saved him from some of the physical abuse other prisoners sometimes received from the crowds, but it made his helplessness even more visible. The carts arrived at the Place de la Révolution around 4 p.m. The guillotine stood on a raised platform, clearly visible to the massive crowd that had gathered. This wasn't unusual. Executions drew large crowds in 1794. Thousands of people would come to watch, especially for significant prisoners. The execution of Robespierre and his allies was the most significant execution. Since the king himself had been guillotined in January 1793, Charles Henry Sansson was waiting. He'd been the official executioner of Paris since 1778, and he'd personally executed thousands of people during the Revolution. He'd guillotined King Louis XVI. He'd executed Marie Antoinette. He'd executed the Girondins, the Hébétists, the Dantonists, and countless others caught in the terrorist machinery. In memoirs written later by his son who assisted him, the Sansson family described the execution of Robespierre as one of the most memorable of the entire revolutionary period, not because the process was different, but because of who was dying. The execution order mattered. The most significant prisoner traditionally went last. This gave the crowd time to build anticipation and ensured maximum impact for the final death. So Robespierre would watch 21 men die before his turn came. One by one they were taken from the carts, led up to the platform, positioned at the guillotine, and executed. The process for each prisoner took only a few minutes. Blade up, prisoner positioned, blade down, head in the basket. Next prisoner. Sansson and his assistants had practiced this routine thousands of times. It ran like clockwork. Augustin Robespierre, Maximilian's younger brother, went before him. He'd followed his older brother into revolutionary politics, supported his policies, helped implement the terror. Now he climbed the steps to the platform and died under the same blade that would soon take his brother. Maximilian had to watch. Couthon was carried to the guillotine, still paralyzed. St. Just went calmly, reportedly without showing any visible emotion. One by one, the architects of the terror died by their own machine. Each time the blade fell, the crowd roared. This wasn't the respectful silence that had marked the king's execution. This wasn't the mixed reaction that sometimes met the deaths of less prominent prisoners. This was celebratory. People cheered, applauded, shouted insults at the corpses. The atmosphere was almost festival-like. After months of living under the terror, watching neighbors denounced and friends arrested, Paris was expressing its relief that the worst might finally be over. But here's what makes this moment historically crucial. The crowd's celebration wasn't celebrating justice. They were celebrating the death of a man who'd been executed without trial, without defense, without any real legal process. They were cheering for the same system that had killed thousands before Robespierre. The terror wasn't being dismantled, it was simply changing targets, and the crowds were too relieved to notice or care about the distinction. By early evening, 21 men were dead. Only Robespierre remained. The sun was starting to lower. The crowd had been watching for hours, but nobody was leaving. Everyone wanted to see the final execution. Guards took Robespierre from the cart and led him toward the platform. This was the moment his enemies had been waiting for. The man who'd sent thousands to this exact spot was finally taking his own turn, and the crowds were about to witness something that would become one of the most infamous details of the entire French Revolution. Robespierre climbed the steps to the guillotine platform. Guards supported him because the blood loss and pain from his jaw wound had weakened him considerably. He'd been bleeding for nearly 15 hours at this point, with no medical treatment beyond the crude bandage wrapped around his head and jaw. That bandage, soaked with blood, was about to become the focal point of one of the most documented moments in revolutionary history. Here's what multiple eyewitness accounts confirm about what happened next. Charles Henry Sansson, the executioner, had a problem. The guillotine required precise positioning. The condemned person's neck had to be placed exactly in the lunette, the wooden restraint that held the head in position for the blade. But Robespierre's bandage was in the way. The thick wrapping that held his shattered jaw together prevented proper positioning. Sansson couldn't secure him in the device with the bandage in place, so Sansson did what he had to do. He ripped the bandage off. The accounts of what happened in that moment are remarkably consistent across multiple sources. Robespierre let out a scream, not a shout, not a cry. A scream of pure agony that was reportedly audible over the noise of the crowd. His shattered jaw, which had been somewhat stabilized by the bandage, fell loose. Pieces of broken teeth and bone fragments that had been held in place by the wrapping came free. Blood poured from the wound, fresh and bright red. The pain must have been indescribable. The crowd's reaction to this moment reveals something crucial about how the terror had brutalized Parisian society. They cheered, they laughed, they applauded the spectacle of Robespierre's agony. Contemporary accounts describe people shouting, "That's what you deserve," and "How does it feel now?" Some witnesses reported that the cheering actually grew louder when Robespierre screamed, as if his pain was entertainment. Think about what this moment represents. This wasn't a quick, efficient execution. This was torture, accidental perhaps, but torture nonetheless. And the crowd that had gathered to watch revolutionary justice being served was celebrating human suffering. The terror hadn't just killed thousands, it had normalized cruelty. It had taught ordinary people to find satisfaction in the pain of others, as long as those others were designated as enemies. Sansson's assistants quickly positioned Robespierre in the guillotine, with his jaw hanging loose and blood flowing freely. He was secured in the lunette, the wooden restraint closed around his neck. His head was now locked in position, unable to move. In memoirs later attributed to the Sansson family, they noted that Robespierre's eyes were open and he appeared fully conscious right up until the blade fell. Unlike some prisoners who fainted from fear or shock, Robespierre experienced every second of his final moments with complete clarity. The blade dropped. The revolutionary government had designed the guillotine to be humane, a quick death compared to older execution methods. The entire process from blade release to death took maybe 2 seconds. Robespierre's head fell into the basket. The executioner's assistant lifted it up to show the crowd, as was customary for significant executions. More cheering, more applause. The architect of the terror was dead. But here's what makes this execution more terrifying than his enemies claimed. It wasn't justice. It wasn't tyranny being overthrown. It was the terror working exactly as Robespierre had designed it. Quick, efficient, ruthless, no trial needed, no defense allowed, no mercy shown. The only difference between Robespierre's death and the deaths of the 16,000+ people executed during the terror was that Robespierre's was celebrated more enthusiastically. The bodies of Robespierre and his allies were taken to a mass grave. No elaborate funeral, no monument, no recognition of their service to the revolution, and there had been genuine service before the terror consumed them. They were buried in an unmarked pit, just like most of their victims. The republic they'd tried to save through violence had consumed them with the same violence. Contemporary accounts describe the mood in Paris that evening as almost euphoric. People celebrated in the streets, taverns were full of people drinking to the death of the tyrant. There was a genuine sense that the worst was over, that the killing would stop now that Robespierre was gone, and in some ways they were right. The terror did begin to wind down after Thermidor. The pace of executions decreased. Some prisoners were released. The revolutionary tribunal was eventually abolished, but the system itself didn't fundamentally change, not immediately. The same people who'd helped Robespierre build the terror remained in power. Fouch, who'd committed atrocities during his time in Lyon, survived and thrived. Barras, who'd led the attack on the Hôtel de Ville, became one of the most powerful men in France. Tallien, who'd shouted down Robespierre in the convention, continued his political career. They'd eliminated Robespierre, but they kept the machinery he'd helped create. The real terror of Robespierre's last day wasn't his suffering, though that was genuine and documented. It wasn't the crowd's cruelty, though that revealed how brutalized society had become. The real terror was how perfectly the system worked, how efficiently it processed him, how easily it transitioned from killing his enemies to killing him. The machine he'd fed so diligently simply changed targets and kept running. That's what makes his final hours more terrifying than any propaganda could claim, because it proves that the terror wasn't about individuals, it was about a system. And systems don't die when their architects do. The French Revolution gave the world a famous phrase, coined by one of its early victims. Pierre Vergniaud, a Girondin executed in October 1793, reportedly said before his death, "The revolution is like Saturn. It devours its own children." He was right, but not in the way most people think. The revolution didn't randomly consume its leaders. It consumed them systematically, using the exact mechanisms they'd built to consume others. Let's trace the pattern, because Robespierre's fate wasn't unique. Jacques Hebert, the radical journalist who'd pushed for more extreme revolutionary measures, was guillotined in March 1794. Georges Danton, who'd helped establish the Revolutionary Tribunal, was executed in April 1794. Camille Desmoulins, who'd written some of the revolution's most influential propaganda, died alongside Danton. Pierre Gaspard Chomet, who'd helped implement revolutionary dechristianization, was executed in April 1794. One by one, the revolution's architects climbed the scaffold. Each time, the process was the same. Accusation by former allies, swift arrest, minimal or no trial. Execution. The machinery worked perfectly because they'd designed it to work perfectly. They'd eliminated safeguards, abolished traditional legal protections, streamlined the process from accusation to death. They'd argued this was necessary to save the Republic from its enemies. And then, inevitably, they became the enemies. Robespierre's execution on July 28, 1794, marked the end of the terror's most intense phase. But here's the crucial historical reality. It didn't end the terror because people suddenly rediscovered moral principles or respect for human rights. It ended because the people who'd helped create it realized it threatened them personally. The Thermidorian reaction, as historians call the period after Robespierre's fall, wasn't a triumph of justice over tyranny. It was self-preservation by the remaining revolutionaries who didn't want to be next. The statistics are revealing. During the 13 months before Robespierre's fall, approximately 16,594 people were officially executed by guillotine across France. That number doesn't include people killed in civil wars, massacres, or deaths in prison. In Paris alone, the pace of executions accelerated dramatically in June and July. 1,794, about 1,400 people were guillotined in those final 6 weeks. That's when the machine was running at peak efficiency, right before it took its architect. After Thermidor, executions did decrease, but they didn't stop. The Revolutionary Tribunal continued operating until May 1795. People continued to be arrested, tried, and executed, just at a slower pace. The difference was that the justification changed. Before Thermidor, victims were enemies of the Republic. After Thermidor, victims were supporters of Robespierre. The machine kept running. It just printed new tickets. Here's what historians have documented about the terror's true nature. It wasn't primarily about ideology or political theory. It was about power and control in a time of extreme crisis. France in 1793 to 1794 was fighting wars on multiple fronts, facing internal rebellion, dealing with economic collapse and food shortages. The revolutionary government used terror as a tool to maintain control, execute potential opponents before they can organize, silence dissent through fear, create a system where everyone knows that any misstep could be fatal. Robespierre genuinely believed he was saving the Republic. His personal papers and speeches show a man who saw himself as incorruptible, as someone willing to do terrible things for the greater good. He called himself the Incorruptible because he believed he couldn't be corrupted by personal interests, that he served only virtue and the Republic. But that absolute certainty, that conviction that he was right and everyone who disagreed was not just wrong but evil, that's what made the terror possible. The system he helped create didn't require evil men to operate. It just required men who were absolutely certain they were right. Once you establish that your cause is so important that it justifies any method, once you decide that your enemies are so dangerous that they don't deserve legal protection, once you create machinery that can quickly eliminate anyone designated as a threat, that machinery will eventually target everyone, including you. Modern historians studying the French Revolution have extensively analyzed this pattern. Marissa Linton's work on revolutionary terror shows how revolutionary leaders justified increasingly extreme measures as necessary responses to threats, real or perceived. Peter McPhee's biography of Robespierre reveals a man who became trapped by the logic of the system he'd helped create, unable to step back without appearing weak or complicit with enemies. Colin Jones's analysis of Thermidor demonstrates how Robespierre's fall was less a defeat of tyranny and more a reorganization of power among people who'd all participated in the terror. The legacy of Robespierre's last day isn't about one man's downfall. It's about what happens when legal protections are eliminated in the name of emergency, when accusation becomes evidence, when efficiency in eliminating enemies becomes more important than determining whether they're actually enemies, when a society decides that some people don't deserve trials because the threat they represent is too great. Every one of those decisions made sense to the people making them at the time. Every one of them was justified as necessary to save the Republic. And every one of them created a machine that couldn't distinguish between guilty and innocent, between actual threats and convenient scapegoats, between enemies of the state and architects of the state. The machine just killed whoever was placed in front of it. For 13 months, Robespierre helped decide who got placed there. On July 28, 1794, he learned what it felt like when the machine's targeting system swiveled toward him. The truly terrifying thing about Robespierre's last day isn't that he suffered. It's not that he died without a real trial. It's not even that the crowds celebrated his agony. The truly terrifying thing is how perfectly normal his execution was by the standards he'd helped establish. The system worked exactly as designed. The machine processed him efficiently. The legal framework he'd supported eliminated any possibility of defense. And then the blade fell, and France moved on to its next crisis, with most of the same people still in power, having learned nothing except how to avoid being next. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Robespierre's final hours prove something that tyrants throughout history have repeatedly discovered. The tools of oppression don't belong to anyone. They're not loyal. They don't discriminate between user and target. They're just tools, and anyone can pick them up and point them in any direction. Build a machine efficient enough to kill your enemies without trial, and eventually someone will use that same machine to kill you. That's not justice. That's not revenge. That's just how machines work. And that's what makes Robespierre's last day more terrifying than any of his enemies ever claimed.